The cottage always felt too still before anyone arrived. I moved through it that morning like a ghost, my footsteps muffled on the worn pine floors, the salt air slipping in through cracked windows. Outside, the ocean murmured, a low hum that never quite stopped. I ran a cloth over the wooden banister in the hall, polishing it until it gleamed faintly under the gray light filtering through the blinds. It wasn't dirty. I just couldn't sit still. My hands needed something to do, something to hold, as if I were preparing for a guest who mattered more than I'd admit. Lucas was coming today, my husband Daniel's nephew. I hadn't seen him in years, not since he was 16, all elbows and knees, trailing sand into the house from the beach every summer. Back then, he'd leave his flip-flops in a heap by the door, the rubber soles caked with grit, and I'd scold him half-heartedly while he grinned. Now, Daniel had said he was different. Older, of course, 27, but changed in ways I couldn't picture. I tried to imagine him taller, broader maybe, but all I could summon was the way he used to watch me sometimes. Not like a kid staring at an ant, but like someone puzzling out a question he wasn't supposed to ask. I folded a faded quilt in the guest room, smoothing it over the bed for the third time that day. The scent of lavender from the dryer sheets clung to the air, soft and clean, like a promise I hadn't meant to make. Downstairs, I opened the kitchen cabinet and pulled out a chipped blue mug, one with a handle worn smooth from years of use. I set it on the counter without thinking, then paused. It was his favorite, wasn't it? From those summers when he'd sit at the table, slurping cocoa while Daniel rambled about tide charts. I left it there anyway, telling myself it didn't mean anything. The knock came just after noon. I heard Daniel shuffle to the door, his voice booming a welcome as it swung open. "There he is. Good to see you, kid." I stayed back, lingering in the kitchen, my fingers brushing the edge of the sink. I took a breath, steadying myself, then stepped into the hall. Daniel stood there, broad and graying, clapping Lucas on the shoulder. And then I saw him. He was taller than I'd expected, lean but solid, like he'd grown into himself. His hair was dark, a little messy from the wind, and his hazel eyes caught the light as they flicked toward me. "Grace," he said, voice deeper than I remembered. "You haven't changed." He smiled, just a tilt of his mouth, and I laughed. Too quick, too light, mumbling something about how time sneaks up on you. But he didn't look away. Not right away. There was something in his gaze, steady and warm, that made my chest tighten for half a second before I turned to grab a pitcher from the counter. Dinner was a performance. Daniel sat at the head of the table, his fork waving as he launched into one of his old fishing stories. The one about the marlin that got away, the line snapping just as he'd nearly reeled it in. I'd heard it 100 times. I nodded when he paused, smiled when he chuckled, but my eyes kept drifting across the table. Lucas sat there, cutting into his steak, listening with that quiet way he had. He didn't say much, just a, "Yeah?" or a low laugh when Daniel hit the punchline. But I felt him there, like a current running under the surface of the room. Once, when I reached for my glass, my hand trembled. Just a flicker, barely noticeable. I told myself it was the wine. The Pinot Grigio Danielle had opened with a flourish. Lucas glanced up then, his fork pausing midair. "Good stuff," he said, nodding at the bottle, but his eyes stayed on me a beat too long. I sipped, the cold liquid sharp against my tongue, and set the glass down carefully. "It's Daniel's pick," I said, forcing a smile. He nodded again, slow, like he was turning something over in his mind. The clatter of plates filled the silence after that. Daniel leaned back, patting his stomach, already planning tomorrow's errands. Something about a boat rental, a trip to the pier. I cleared the table, stacking dishes in the sink, the porcelain cool against my palms. Lucas stood to help, reaching past me to grab a napkin that had fallen to the floor. His arm brushed mine, just for a second, and I froze, the air catching in my throat. "Thanks," I muttered, stepping back too fast. He didn't say anything, just straightened up and carried the plates to the counter. When I turned off the kitchen light later, the house settled into its familiar quiet. Daniel's voice drifted from the living room, calling me to join them for some old movie. I didn't answer. Instead, I climbed the stairs, the hem of my skirt brushing my calves, and told myself I was tired. But as I closed the bedroom door behind me, I knew it wasn't exhaustion keeping me awake that night. It was something else, something I hadn't named yet, stirring in the dark, like the tide outside. I slipped into the bathroom after dinner, the door clicking shut behind me. The air was cool, tinged with the faint scent of salt from the open window. I stood in front of the mirror, the bulb overhead casting a soft glow that wasn't kind to the lines around my eyes. They weren't deep, just there, marks of years I hadn't minded until now. My fingers brushed the curve of my neck, then lower, tracing the dip of my collarbone where the skin still felt smooth. I wasn't searching for youth or beauty, just something I'd lost track of. A pulse, a flicker, a reason to notice myself again. The hem of my blouse shifted as I moved, and I caught the outline of my shape in the glass. Not bad, I thought, then pushed the idea away. Downstairs, I heard the TV kick on. Some old Western Daniel loved, all gunshots and gravelly voices. I couldn't sit there, sandwiched between them on that sagging couch. One steady and familiar, the other pulling at something I didn't want to name. "Headache," I called down, my voice thin as I climbed the stairs. Daniel grunted something back, unbothered. I shut the bedroom door and slid under the sheets, the cotton cool against my legs. Beside me, Daniel's side was empty, but I could already hear the rhythm of his snores in my head. Steady, predictable, like the tide rolling out. He was kind, always had been, but kindness doesn't burn. It doesn't reach past the surface. I stared at the ceiling, the shadows shifting with the wind outside, and wondered when I'd stopped expecting more than a peck on the cheek. Morning came too soon. I woke before the sun, the room still dim, and lingered in bed longer than usual. When I finally got up, I stood in front of the closet, fingers hovering over a linen dress I hadn't worn in years. It was light, a pale blue that caught the sun just right, the fabric thin enough to hint at what lay beneath without saying too much. I slipped it on, the hem brushing my calves, and dabbed a touch of perfume behind my ears. Jasmine, faint, but there. Not for anyone, I told myself, just to feel the day shift under my skin. In the kitchen, Lucas was already up, barefoot on the tile, pouring coffee into that chipped blue mug. Steam curled up, catching the morning light slanting through the window. "Morning," he said, his voice low, rough with sleep. He glanced at me, then back at the mug, a small smile tugging at his mouth. "You remembered." I shrugged, busying myself with the kettle. "It was just there," I said, but the words felt flimsy. Daniel shuffled in a moment later, hair still damp from the shower, breaking the quiet with talk of a grocery run. "Need anything from town?" he asked, already halfway out the door. I shook my head and he was gone, the screen door banging shut behind him. The day stretched out slow and heavy. I moved through the house, wiping counters that didn't need it, folding towels that were already neat. Lucas stayed close, not hovering, just there, fixing a loose hinge on the pantry, reaching for a jar of honey on the top shelf. His shirt lifted as he stretched, showing a sliver of skin above his jeans, tan and taut. I turned away, stacking plates in the sink, but the image stuck. "Need a hand?" he asked once, coming up behind me as I wrestled with a stuck window. His breath brushed my ear, and I shook my head too fast. "Got it," I said, shoving the frame up with a creak. He stepped back, hands in his pockets, but I could feel his eyes on me, steady and quiet. By afternoon, I was out on the deck, sweeping sand off the boards. The sun cut through the clouds, warm on my shoulders, and I paused, leaning on the broom. Lucas stepped outside, a glass of water in his hand. "Hot out here," he said, offering it. I took it, our fingers brushing for half a second, and drank deep, the cold sliding down my throat. He sat on the railing, leaning back, gazing out at the waves. The way his arms flexed, the slope of his chest under that faded t-shirt. It shouldn't have mattered, but it did. I swept harder, the bristles scraping wood, telling myself it was nothing. My pulse said otherwise. Sleep wouldn't come that night. I lay in bed, The sheets twisted around my legs, the sound of the ocean seeping through the cracked window like a restless whisper. Daniel's breathing beside me was steady, a soft wheeze on the exhale, but it only made the room feel smaller. I stared at the ceiling, tracing the faint outline of a water stain from last year's storm, until the weight of it all pushed me up. My feet hit the cool floor, and I padded barefoot down the hall, craving water, clarity, anything to quiet the hum under my skin. The kitchen was dark, just a sliver of moonlight cutting across the tile. I reached for a glass, but a shadow moved near the fridge, and I froze. Lucas stood there, shirtless, the dim glow catching the lines of his shoulders, his chest. He turned, half startled, a bottle of water in his hand. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, voice low, like he didn't want to break the stillness. I nodded, my throat tight, and stepped closer to the sink. His eyes caught mine in the dark, and something passed between us. Not words, just a heat that made my breath hitch. I filled my glass, the water rushing too loud, and turned away without a sound. Back in bed, I pressed a hand to my chest, my skin warm, my pulse a quiet riot. I didn't sleep. I didn't want to. Morning dragged in, slow and heavy. Daniel was up early, rattling pans, planning bacon and eggs like it was some grand event. I stayed upstairs picking at the hem of my nightgown, until the smell pulled me down. Lucas was at the table, hair still mussed, sipping coffee from that blue mug. "Morning," he said again, squinting against the sun pouring through the window. I mumbled something back, keeping my hands busy with the kettle. Daniel left soon after, muttering about a boat rental in town, the screen door slapping shut behind him. The house went quiet, and I felt Lucas's presence like a weight I couldn't shake. I tried to fill the day with small things, wiping down the fridge, folding a stack of dish towels, but he was everywhere. He lingered in the living room, flipping through an old magazine, then stepped outside to check the deck railing. I watched him through the window, the way he bent to test a loose board, his jeans pulling tight across his thighs. My hand stilled on the cloth I was holding, and I turned away, cheeks warm. "Need anything fixed in here?" he called through the screen. "I'm good," I said, too quick, and busied myself with the sink. By evening, the air felt thicker, like it was holding its breath. I opened a bottle of Pinot Noir, the cork popping sharp in the quiet. "Want a glass?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Lucas looked up from the couch, nodded, and followed me out to the deck. The waves crashed below, steady and endless, and I put on some jazz, soft, no words, just piano notes drifting around us like smoke. We sat on the wicker chairs, the wine dark and bold on my tongue. "Nice night," he said, leaning back, his glass resting on his knee. "Yeah," I agreed, but my eyes kept sliding to the curve of his forearm, the faint stubble along his jaw. We talked a little. Old summers when he'd chase crabs on the beach, his job now, fixing up cars in the city. But the pauses stretched longer, heavier, like they were waiting for something. When I stood to head inside, he stood too, closer than he needed to be. I stepped past him, my arm brushing his, and his fingers grazed mine. Just a touch, light as a question. I didn't pull away. I looked up and he was right there, his breath warm, his eyes steady. Then he kissed me. It wasn't rushed or clumsy. It was slow, deliberate, his lips soft but sure against mine. My hands hovered, then settled on his arms, feeling the warmth of his skin through the thin cotton of his shirt. Blood rushed to my ears, my body waking up too fast, too easy. I could taste the wine on him, sharp and alive, and for a moment I forgot where I was. But I pulled back first, my breath uneven, my legs unsteady beneath me. I started, but didn't finish. I turned and walked inside, the screen door creaking shut behind me. Upstairs, I stood in the dark, one hand against the wall, the other tracing my lips where they still tingled. I didn't want to forget. I wasn't sure I could. Morning came with a weight I couldn't shake. I woke late, the sheets damp from a night spent twisting in half-dreams, his kiss still burning faint beneath my skin. Daniel was already up, his side of the bed cool, his voice drifting up from the kitchen with the clatter of a spoon against a mug. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the fog in my head to lift. It didn't. When I finally swung my legs over the edge, my body felt heavy, like it knew something I hadn't said out loud yet. Downstairs, Daniel was at the table scrolling his phone, a half-eaten piece of toast in front of him. "Sleep okay?" he asked, not looking up. "Fine," I lied, pouring coffee into a white mug, the bitter scent grounding me for a moment. He glanced at me then, his eyes soft but distant, and said, "How about we head to the coast's edge? That little place by the cliffs, just the three of us, get some air." I should have said no. I should have had a reason ready. Headache, chores, anything. But my mouth stayed shut too long, and he took it as a yes. "Good," he said, standing. "I'll pack the cooler." I went upstairs to pack, moving like someone else was steering me. I opened the dresser, pulling out a silk blouse, ivory, soft, the kind that clung just enough, and a skirt that hugged my hips a little too well. I folded them into a small suitcase, my hands lingering on the fabric, then added a pair of sandals I hadn't worn in years. It wasn't about comfort. It was about how I'd look stepping out of the car, the wind tugging at the hem. I zipped the bag shut and caught my reflection in the mirror, my hair loose, my jaw tight. I didn't recognize the woman staring back. The drive was quiet, the SUV humming along the coastal road. Daniel kept up a steady stream of chatter, something about a new pier being built, the weather turning, a song on the radio he swore he'd heard in '98. I nodded from the passenger seat, my hands folded in my lap, but my eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror. Lucas sat in the back, one arm slung across the seat, staring out the window at the blur of dunes and sea oats. His face was calm, unreadable, but every time I shifted, adjusting my skirt, brushing hair from my neck, I felt him there, a steady pull I couldn't ignore. The cottage at the coast's edge hadn't changed. Same weathered steps, same rusted wind chimes clinking in the breeze. It smelled of cedar and salt, the air thick with memories of barbecues and rainy days spent with board games. We settled in fast. Daniel hauled out a toolbox to fix a loose shutter, muttering about rust and wind. Lucas carried firewood from the shed, stacking it by the hearth, his shirt damp with sweat by the time he finished. I unpacked the cooler, bread, cheese, a bottle of gin, my hands moving on autopilot. It looked normal, felt normal, but beneath it all, something simmered. Dinner was a strange dance. The three of us sat around the oak table, a single bulb overhead casting long shadows. Daniel told a story about a crab trap he'd lost years ago, his voice warm, his laugh easy. I smiled when I was supposed to, passed the butter when he asked, but my eyes kept drifting to Lucas. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, listening with that quiet intensity he had. "Ever catch anything big?" he asked Daniel, his voice low, and I watched the way his fingers curled around his glass, steady and sure. Daniel didn't see it, didn't see me watching, but I felt it, sharp and alive in my chest. After, I went to the kitchen alone, running dishes under warm water, the steam rising around me. The floor creaked behind me, and I didn't need to turn to know it was Lucas. He didn't say anything, just stood there, close enough that I could feel the space between us shrink. I dried my hands on a towel, slow, deliberate, my breath catching in my throat. When I turned, he was nearer than I'd thought, his hazel eyes steady, serious. I reached for the counter, my arm brushing his chest in the tight space, and heat curled down my spine. He didn't move. I didn't either. "Dishes done?" he asked, voice soft. "Yeah," I said, stepping aside, my skirt swaying against my legs as I walked out. Later that night, the power flickered out. A gust from the sea, Daniel guessed. He grabbed a flashlight and headed outside, grumbling about old wiring. I sat on the edge of the bed, the room near dark, the wind howling through the cracks. Then Lucas was there, in the doorway, barefoot, a plain t-shirt clinging to him from the damp air. He leaned against the frame, the faint light catching the edge of his jaw. We didn't speak. I stood, my nightgown brushing my thighs, and stepped toward him, each move slow, like I wasn't sure it was mine. We stopped inches apart, breathing shallow. the scent of rain and cedar on him. Daniel's voice cut through from below. "Found it!" And we pulled back, the moment snapping shut. I climbed into bed beside Daniel later, his snores filling the dark. But my mind stayed upstairs, trapped in that unspoken space, teetering on the edge of something I couldn't turn back from. Rain lingered into the morning, a soft patter against the roof that blurred the world outside. I stood by the kitchen sink, barefoot, a mug of black coffee warming my hands. The steam rose, curling in the damp air, and I watched droplets slide down the window, each one tracing its own shaky path. I'd barely slept, lying beside Daniel all night, his warmth a quiet wall I couldn't cross. His hand had brushed mine in the dark, accidental, and I'd turned away, waiting for dawn like it might bring answers. It didn't. The house creaked above me, slow, heavy steps, and I knew it was Lucas, awake too. Daniel was up soon after, humming as he fried eggs, the sizzle filling the silence. "Garden needs work," he said over breakfast, wiping his hands on a napkin. "Maybe we'll fix the trellis today." I nodded, sipping my coffee, my fingers tight around the mug. "And the shed," he added, "could use a new latch." Practical, steady Daniel, always filling the gaps with tasks. Lucas came down then, hair tousled, wearing a gray t-shirt that clung to his shoulders. "I'll head to town," he said, leaning against the counter. "Need paint for the back wall. Faster with 2. He didn't look at me, just at the peeling trim outside. Daniel chuckled. "Go on then, I'll be in the shed." The drive was wrapped in quiet, the SUV cutting through mist that clung to the cliffs. The radio played low, some old blues tune, all gravel and ache. But we didn't talk much. "Road's rough this year," he said once, hands steady on the wheel. "Yeah," I agreed, staring at the sea rolling gray beyond the dunes. My hands stayed in my lap, clenched, but I felt every inch between us, the way his arm flexed, shifting gears, the heat of him just there. In town, we stopped at a hardware store, the air thick with sawdust and oil. He loaded paint cans into the trunk, his shirt sticking to his back in the drizzle. "This enough?" I asked, voice lower than I meant. He turned, wiping his hands on his jeans. "It's not just about paint," he said, quiet, honest. My chest tightened, but I nodded, climbing back into the car. On the way back, the road curved sharp around the coast, trees arching overhead, their branches dripping wet. I reached up to adjust the visor, my hand falling slow between us, close to his on the gear shift. He didn't move, didn't flinch, and neither did I. The silence grew thick, not heavy, alive. My breath caught, and I glanced at him, his jaw tight, his eyes flicking to the road and back. Then I slid my hand over his, light, barely a touch. He turned his palm up, slow, his fingers wrapping around mine, warm and rough. No one had held me like that in years, not with that kind of presence. My heart thudded too fast, and I pulled back after a moment, the heat of him lingering on my skin. We didn't say a word the rest of the drive. Back at the cottage, Daniel was in the shed, hammering at something, the sound echoing sharp through the fog. I carried a bag of groceries inside, stacking cans on the shelf. Peaches, soup, things I didn't care about. Lucas stepped in behind me, paint cans clanking as he set them down. "I'll start out back," he said, his voice even, but his eyes brushed mine, quick and deliberate. I nodded, clutching a jar of olives I hadn't meant to hold so long, my pulse loud in my ears. He walked out, and I stood there, the air thick again, like it was waiting. Later, I went upstairs, the damp air sticking to my skin. I needed to change, to wash the day off, to breathe. In the guest bathroom, I leaned against the sink, the mirror fogged from the heat. I wiped it clear, staring at myself, my blouse damp at the neck, my hair curling wild from the mist. I unbuttoned it slow, letting it fall, and stood there in my bra. Lavender, soft lace I'd picked that morning without a reason. It felt like a secret now, clinging to me, and I swapped it for a black one. Simple, sleek. Not for him, I told myself, just to feel awake, different. Downstairs I heard his voice, low and steady, talking to Daniel about the paint. I didn't catch the words, just the rhythm of it, rolling through me like the waves outside. I sat on the edge of the bed, running my hands down my arms, feeling the fabric of my skirt shift. It was easy now, too easy, slipping into this, into the quiet ache of wanting him there. I wasn't pretending anymore. I was preparing. And the worst part was I didn't feel ashamed. I felt alive, sharp, like I'd been asleep for years and someone had finally turned on the light. When I went back down, Daniel smiled at me from the porch, oblivious, and I smiled back. But my eyes found Lucas, and I knew he saw it too.